Welcome to Extremely Valid Points.
We are three business owners and friends who enjoy practical, real-life discussions about business, marketing, and creativity.
Your hosts are Nathan and Jenny Sala, the owners of World Light Media, a digital marketing agency focused on helping organizations grow through online leads.
And Dave Wilkins, the owner of Ellipsis Production Co., a video production company that specializes in creating meaningful content for businesses and nonprofits.
We hope you enjoy today's episode. And along the way, we just might happen to make some extremely valid points.
Welcome back to Extremely Valid Points. We are so glad you decided to join us today. We are here again with Jocelyn Grundy. Jocelyn is the owner of Bloom Insights, a market research company, and she's joining us for part 2 of our conversation about market research. Welcome back, Jocelyn.
Welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for being here.
So in our previous episode, we talked a little bit about what market research is, why it's important, qualitative versus quantitative research, really important stuff, and how it can affect your brand and how it can save you some money, affect your decisions you're making when you're choosing to take a product or to market and how you take it to market. Before we jump into more discussion about market research, I would love to just hear a little bit more about your story and what you tell us why you love what you do, and tell us a little bit more about how you run your business.
Yeah, sure. So, I think it's been really an interesting journey. As I mentioned, I've been in market research for 18 years, or is that right? No, 17 years. And I think the first 4 years I worked full time for 2 different companies. But I started to do freelancing more out of necessity, actually. We were living in Southern California, and I worked for a company that was 40 miles away. And I was pregnant after I had my second child. You know, during the course of my pregnancy, I was waking up at 5 a.m. to get to the carpool, and get there by like 6 a.m. and so that we can avoid traffic. Like everything was about avoiding traffic because it was 40 miles away. And I just, whenever I was on maternity leave, I was thinking, God, I cannot go back to this. Like, I really did like my job, but I just felt like I can't do this with having 2 small kids and having like my day being dictated by traffic and just being away for, 12 hours and things like that. So I ended up quitting. Actually, after much prayer, I ended up quitting. And
that was probably a hard choice to
It
make.
was a very hard choice. We weren't like rolling in the dough or anything. So it was a very hard choice. I thank my husband for being supportive. I did feel like it was, I was being obedient to what I felt like the Lord was telling me to do. So after like 2 weeks after I told my boss, he called me and said, Jocelyn, well, had you ever considered contracting? And I'm like, no, I didn't think about that, because the only contractors I knew were people who were retired and like were experts in coming back. And so I only had at that point like 4 years of experience. So I was like, no, I hadn't considered it. But he said, yeah, you should. Yeah, I would love to have you come back on board, and you could work from home and you could do it part-time. So that was kind of an opening, and I still am in contact with that person who I consider to be like a lifelong friend. So, awesome. So I started out just doing the contracting, and then, someone would leave that company and go to a different company, and they would recommend me as, a contractor or a consultant because of the experience we had together. And that's kind of how it grew. I never really, within the business, it never really actively tried to seek out work. It was always more word of mouth. And so it lasted for like 10 years like that. And I think it was still lasting, but from a family standpoint, my husband started working for a job where it didn't have family health insurance. And by this time we had 5 kids. So I felt like it was probably wise for me to like try to seek out something where we had family health insurance. And so that's why I ended up working full time for a couple of years, mostly for health insurance. So it was really actually in January 2021, so just like a little over a year ago, the job I was working at full time had like a pretty massive layoff, and my whole team was let go.
Wow.
So I was laid off, and I felt like it was kind of a blessing in disguise. And not even so much in disguise, because I was working. I was working a ton because it was a long story, but I was working a ton, and so pretty much like literally like a week later from that, I started contracting back for that company.
Wow.
Wow.
And so, obviously it worked out in terms of like my husband had found another job, or he had started in January with another job where now we had family health insurance. So that was no longer a concern. And I was able to go back into contracting, or consulting. I say contracting and consulting because I do contract like through a contracting agency for one company, and then I do consulting projects for 3 others right now. And typically it's the bandwidth has always been like between 3 to 4 clients at a time. Which is good for me in terms of the number of hours I'm able to dedicate, usually like 40 to 50 hours a week. So, yeah, so that's it.
So there's a pattern here that I noticed. You work for a company, you leave the job, either quit or get laid off, and then they hire you back as soon as possible,
that's true.
and whatever it takes. I think that speaks to the fact that you're probably indispensable
Oh,
in
thank
the role
you.
that you do.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm thankful for that. I can't take any credit. As I said in the last episode, most of my work has been on prayers, so I'm glad that they see that it's a good quality, and I can't take all the credit for that, but I'm thankful for the opportunities. And just, I think that that's probably one thing I would want to say. And I know, especially for anyone who's in a small business, you kind of have to roll with the punches. Like, you have to kind of see the silver linings and know that sometimes when a door closes, it's because another door is going to open. And, you, as long as you can kind of keep on going and don't be too discouraged, just keep on going, then things usually work out.
Yeah.
That's good.
Now, I know you've mentioned to me, so you work from home, you have 6 kids, right? And you are working 40 to 50 hours a week, but thankfully you get to kind of dictate when you work a little bit. But you mentioned to me this problem of having too much work. What's that like, and how are you managing that?
Well, Jenny, that is an area where I have not mastered. So I think I keep on thinking I should like try to get someone who can help me with this work. By the way, this might be a good opportunity for that.
Yeah.
I do feel like I've had a hard time. I have tried to get someone to help me a couple of times in the past, and not to say it doesn't work out, but I feel like I'm probably not the best person of like letting go and just like turning everything over. So I do think that probably is a hindrance to growth. As I'm speaking out loud again, just kind of thinking out loud. It's probably a hindrance to growth because I probably could have more clients or things like that if I actually had someone to help and I knew how to like instruct them and give up control.
Sure.
So I think, yeah.
I think that's a common problem for all of us.
Okay.
For sure. I know when, we started out, it was just Nathan and I. At first it was Nathan, and then I joined, and he had to slowly allow me to have some control over some things. And then when it was time to hire, it was a big step for us, just knowing how to trust other people, knowing what it's going to be like. And you definitely learn as you go. And but I think it's wonderful when you can find the right person to come alongside you and help. So
Yeah, I think, and it's delegation, right? That's the skill, and we're not born with it. We have to learn it and develop it, and it's hard because, you have clients that trust you, and if you take off something off your plate and let somebody else run with it, well, you might lose that client. That's the risk. But it's also rewarding when you do find that you have the freedom to grow your company and, allow people to, empower people, give them the authority, and then they surprise you. And that's the dream, right?
Yeah, that's true. That's inspiring to hear from both of you. Yeah.
And I love it when you can take one of the things that you don't like doing so much and Find somebody who loves doing that and wants to do that, and you can give it to them, and then you don't have to do it anymore.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay, so do you have any advice for other people out there who are, maybe just starting a business or maybe in market research? What things have you learned over the years? What advice would you give?
I think that the main advice I'd give is just to keep learning. I think that the tools that are available within market research are constantly changing and they're constantly evolving. So you can't just think, oh, I'm an expert, I know everything, and then just not keep learning. I think it's important to keep up to date with new software, with new techniques. And also just in terms of like the client side, this is a common thing, but, just to make sure that you're being flexible for your client, that even if it's stressful to you, that you're not necessarily letting that show and come across. I think that that's been one area that has worked well, is that I try to be pleasant. You know what I mean? I think sometimes people want to work, I don't want to say this like as a bragging way, but I think sometimes people want to work with me because it's not stressful. You know what I mean? So I think that if you can bring that to the table as well, as kind of a benefit. So I think the other thing I would say in terms of, for me, in terms of like identifying areas where, there's been times where I've had to cut down on work, and there's been times where I've tried to ramp up work. And I do think that even though I think for me, my inclination is usually to say yes to everything. But then sometimes, if you say yes to too much, then the quality of your work is going to suffer, So I've tried to, there's been a few times where I've had to say, well, I would love to help you right now, but I can't help you right now. But maybe if we revisit this in 3 months, like if you're still open, it's not necessarily shutting the door, but it's also giving you a little bit of time to get your, yourself situated and into a place where you could actually deliver quality work. And I think sometimes that's scary because you don't want to say no to anything, but I think in the long run, everyone wins when you're delivering the best. And I guess that would be, if I had someone working with me, I probably wouldn't have to do that. But yeah, so yeah.
Well, how much, when someone contracts with you or hires you, are they primarily looking for you to execute on something, or to bring strategy, or does it just depend on every client's different?
Yeah, it depends really. And I think that's where I do think that in general, what they're expecting, sometimes it's execution and strategy, and then sometimes it's just strategy.
Okay.
I do execute surveys. I develop surveys and things like that I did, 15 years ago when I first started. But I do think that there's kind of a blend, and I think that that's probably where, in terms of being able to let go, I think, being the face of what I'm offering and kind of like the more wider knowledge that I might have gained, that's where, I think that they're wanting to hire me because of that wider industry experience, and then kind of like how long I've been in research. So.
Yeah. So then if you were to hire additional staff or something like that, they could help with some more of those execution
yes,
tasks.
exactly. Okay, yeah. Yeah, for sure.
If a company wants to hire a market research firm like yours, what kinds of questions should they be asking? How do they know who is the right person to hire?
That's a good question, Jenny. I have to think about that. So I think that what maybe I would say this is like what makes a bad researcher.
Yeah.
I think probably someone who's not really attentive to detail. I think someone probably who makes assumptions, or if you can tell, they kind of have a standard way that they do things. Sometimes that's okay. Like if it's something, again, like we talked about risk, if it's something low risk and the company has a standard way they do this, but usually you need something a little bit more customized to answer your specific question. So I would look for that, like someone who's willing to be flexible and saying like, oh, they're not just going to pull out the same template. That we talked a little bit about the survey platforms, and you can get a template off of any of the survey platforms and do it yourself. Like someone should be able to bring you some expertise and customize to what your needs are. So I think those two things, like if they're kind of asking questions, they're inquisitive and they're detail oriented, and then also if they're thinking about your business, not just about, trying to make it easy for themselves.
How much when you're working with somebody, I think, one of the things that we probably deal with, especially as small business owners, is sometimes we don't realize, how because we're so close to the business and we're working in the business, sometimes we do make a lot of those assumptions, right, about maybe our customer or our market. So how do you draw those things out so that we're not making those same kind of mistakes, or just rolling past something we think, oh, well, everybody feels this way, or everybody wants this, or et cetera?
Yeah, I think that, a lot of times, like within, for example, like in a survey development, like if I'm helping a client develop a survey, sometimes this will come out like where they'll be like, oh, you don't really need to ask this question and this question because we already know that, or like, this is going to be repetitive. And I'll say the way I kind of approach it is I do think there's room to not repeat things like if you just asked a question, but it is something about benchmarking. That's how I'll frame it. Well, even though you know that can serve as a benchmark for other things we might learn in the survey. So let's say, for example, if you know that all of your customers think the price should be $9.99, well, if we include $9.99, but then we also include $12.99, like we'll have a benchmark. So you'll have, your baseline information. So I think that that's a way to get around it. And pricing is probably not the best example of that. It's more sort of like within attitudes or things like that. But I do think there's room for, if you already know something, just to kind of keep it in the back of your mind, but it doesn't necessarily have to be like you should still be open and be flexible to learning more. That's it.
That's great.
So last week you talked a little bit about the difference between qualitative and quantitative, and this might be more of the qualitative side. But when we deal a lot with lists and segmentation and really organizing and categorizing the potential buyers into different groups. So do you find that when you're creating these lists, do you have a profile? Do you work with like a customer profile and like a persona is what we call them? Do you work with those? And what is that like for you?
So I think there's a couple things here. So I think the word segmentation can be like a whole topic of conversation for one episode, because for me, when someone says segmentation, it's really about using a mathematical algorithm to force people into clusters based on common, questions. So I do think that sometimes when people say segmenting, I think you're saying like just dividing the list based on certain criteria, kind of like that, and then developing like a persona, which would be like how you would articulate the person to. Is that what you're saying?
Right.
Yeah. So a lot of the work I do is around both segmentation, like the actual mathematical modeling, and then also a more straightforward way would be to look for common themes within a set of data and kind of divide them into different personas and bring them to life. And I do agree with you, like for qualitative research, that's where that component of bringing them to life can come into play. What I've seen work really well for different companies is sometimes you have to get permission for this, right? But sometimes within the interview, you'll capture the person's responses, and then that's a great way to like have a little excerpt when you're trying to explain this persona to other people. Like you can kind of dial into some of your qualitative research, and you don't have to like pay for an actor or things like that. You can just use the interview in itself as a way to express your persona. So that's one advantage, I think, of qualitative and how you can kind of like maximize the qualitative research. And I've even done that within a quantitative report where I've used excerpts from the video from Qual to explain something that's showing up in Quant.
Interesting. So we try to look at our lists and we might be doing it wrong, but we try to organize our segment, which I know I'm saying it wrong.
No,
after
it's
you just
okay. No,
explained
no,
it.
no, it's okay.
But I think of it in terms of best fit and then like a second tier, like maybe not the best fit, but still a good fit, like most likely to buy, still likely to buy. Do you do that type of segmentation when you're, categorizing or?
Yeah, so I think like sometimes I think like in order, so how the keyword is like actionable, like what is going to make your research actionable, which is basically like how are you going to make money off of this, right?
Profitable.
So, how is it profitable? Yes. So I do think that understanding like, high potential target versus like medium potential target is a good way to think about it. I do think that, I think from what I've seen, I guess when you're trying to get someone to pay for something, for example, I might be saying too much information, I don't know. But if you're trying to get for someone to pay for something, typically you have most success with the current people who pay. You know what I mean? You get that person to pay $1 more versus like someone coming in new to the brand. And the same thing with switching, right? So you have more success with getting someone who's already paying for someone else to come to you versus like starting brand new. So I do think that there's some value in kind of understanding that, like who's already paying, who's already like your high potential target, and focusing in on them and kind of doing most of your work for that sweet spot. And then, even using them in research. So like, for example, usually it really depends on the type of research, but if I was going to launch a national campaign or if a company was going to launch a national campaign and they wanted to do a commercial on it, they would usually do the research with their primary target, like what you're saying, like your top tier, however you want to call it, segment, your top tier high potential target. And then you would also do it with a rep sample just to make sure that you're not offending anyone like widespread. But ultimately, you want to move the needle with that top tier client or customer. Good. Yeah. And also you want it, and then hopefully you'll attract more people who look like them in the general market who maybe aren't aware of you, but like once they are aware of you based on their profile, they should like you too. Right.
Right. That's good. It's good. Okay, and I know we talked about qualitative and quantitative last week, but I have another kind of just theory I want to run by you. So for quantitative research, would you say that type of information is better for figuring out how to market to people, like where to find them, what advertising channels to use, and then qualitative research would be a better route for figuring out how, in terms of like messaging, how to speak to them and what to say to them when you're marketing to them? Am I on? Am I on to something here?
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, so I think like, what would I say? I think that if you wanted to test like, if you had like some messaging that you wanted to test, you could do it quantitatively. But I think the qualitative would elicit that feedback or conversation that can actually help you pinpoint like how to optimize it. So there are ways, again, to do that quantitatively. But if you want that back and forth dynamic and you kind of want to throw out multiple different versions of the same thing and maybe even, adjust on the fly, that's where qualitative would come in. Quantitative is a lot more stagnant. So it would be like if you have messaging where you have like, you already have 5 options and you want to test those 5 options. You're not going to really adjust from there. There's actually a tool called a highlighter tool where you can have them underline or underscore things that are confusing or things that they like and then explain it like in an open-end follow-up question. So there's some dynamic there, but it's not going to be as much as it would be for qualitative. So I would say, I think in terms of I would say, again, like qualitative is more like when you want to get really deep and nuanced with your understanding. And then quantitative would be more if you kind of have like a set amount of information you're wanting to understand. It's not going to get as deep, but it will get you a wider set of information and then kind of get validation on different things you're wanting to learn.
Jocelyn, I would love it if you could tell us, just some practical tips for if somebody wants to kind of DIY their own market research. What would be good for what would be a good place for them to start? Let's say that I'm in business. Let's say I'm a plumber. How do I figure out who my target market is, first of all?
Yeah, so
Anybody with a toilet. Right?
so
We could use any example.
Okay,
If you
well,
want,
so
we can
let's
say somebody else.
stick with this example. Let's get,
Okay,
so
okay.
are you saying like if you're new to the plumbing industry and you
Yes.
want to figure out where you should be marketing and things like that?
Yeah.
So one thing we have not talked about, in addition to understanding your target audience, is understanding your competitive set.
Okay.
So that would be important. That's probably where I would start with, actually, is something they call assess the landscape. It's basically just understanding your competitive set and all large macro factors that might impact your business, right? So that's where I would start. I would say, okay, well, if I go into this zip code, how many people service this area versus, this region? And I would probably try to find the one where there's more need, right? Where there's probably like an underserved community. And then from there, that automatically narrows your pool from everyone with the toilet to, the people with the toilet who don't have enough plumbers, to help them. And so then you can start to say, okay, this is my group of people. Now, what is it about them? Like, why are they underserved? What unmet needs do they have? What's their demographic profile, so that I can use that demographic profile to go to Facebook or go to any of the social media companies and, target my advertisements towards those people. And then from there, you can start to say, okay, well, once I have this target, what else can I offer them? Like, I know they need plumbing services, but are there additional services that they're also lacking? Kind of developing your product portfolio among this group. What is especially important to them? Do they always just want the lowest price, or do they really care about customer service? They don't really care about price as much, or not as price sensitive. Just figuring out from there kind of their priorities and more of like what other needs they have. So kind of like a funnel. It's like a funnel, I guess.
Yeah.
How can I differentiate?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and that what you just said about figuring out what else you can market to them, I think it's so good. You talked about it earlier. We talk about it a lot, how it's so much easier to sell to someone who's already a customer. You already have their buy-in. They already like you. You already have a relationship. So figuring out how you can continue to make them happy and offer services to them is really brilliant. So what if I already have an established base of customers and maybe I am thinking about now I want to go into HVAC or something like that? What would you recommend a company do with market research before they start offering a new service?
Yeah, so I think anytime there's like major expansion, a lot of it will have to do with your brand equity. So like how, even if you have like the functional capacity to offer this, like do people believe you'll do a good job at offering it? So I do think that there's probably room to understand your brand and how strong your brand is before being too broad, right? And so that's probably the first type of research I would do, is something around brand equity to understand like the perceptions around your brand. Do people believe that you can do this? At what price point? And then also to the point around, is it going to be the same audience? Like, are you trying to get into a whole new territory of audience with this? Or is it still going to be like your current clients who are most interested? So, yeah, so those are some of the considerations I would think about.
That's good. And if I wanted to figure out what my brand equity is looking like, how do you think practically from, as a researcher, how would you find that information out?
So a lot of it has to do, well, first you would have to understand your awareness. So like there's easy ways to measure awareness. You usually would do a question like around, like you could do an online survey on Google surveys or something about, how many people have unaided awareness of you. Like if, let's say for my company, let's just say, How many people, when you think about market research companies or market research consultants, who comes to mind? And if I come to mind, I'm part of their unaided awareness. Now, if you have a full list and that's the second question, and aided awareness, you would provide the full list, and then you would say, okay, they're aware of me, and then these other 5 or 6 people they're aware of, and those are my strongest competitors, because those are what people, even if they offer something different, that's who you're aware, have more awareness from. And so then from there, I would want to also understand just in terms of what perception. So that's where the brand equity comes in. Typically, there's a standard list of like around 30 attributes that you can ask about, like core equities, like are you fun? Are you smart? It's just like you could pull this off of Google as well in terms of like what are your associations. But one of the primary things that people look for is trust. Right. So you also want to ask a specific question about how much do people trust you, of those who are aware of you. And so I just think like overall, especially for a new business, probably like the biggest hurdle is driving awareness. Like once you have a strong foothold of awareness, then you can start getting into equity and like making sure your equity is matching up with like what your strategy is. But the first thing is getting, the message out that you're here, so.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, they need to know that you exist before they can decide if they like you or not.
Yes. Yes.
Know, like, trust.
Yeah.
So as a business owner, in your journey and all of your experience, what would you say is your biggest failure in business, and what did you learn from it?
I think for me, it feels so bad. Like for example, I've had a few times where I've had like annual contracts, and if someone doesn't want to renew the contract, then I'm like, oh man, what did I do? Like I thought it was going so well, you don't love me anymore, It's like, but I think with that kind of, it's just asking, being bold enough to ask like, what was it about, the dynamic that didn't work out, or, just kind of asking that why piece and not just leaving it at even times where I've proposed, made a proposal to someone and they didn't, go forward with the proposal. Just asking them, hey, would you mind just giving me, a couple minutes? I'm not trying to attack you or anything. I really just want to know why, so that I can maybe improve for the next time. You're
doing your own market research.
Yeah, you're doing your own market research just so that you know. And then sometimes I think I found that a lot of times it doesn't have anything to do with me, and then I don't feel so bad and beating myself up because it's just like they have budget cuts, or, they just had to prioritize something else that, quarter. But I think asking that why question, but it hurts, like I think that's probably the biggest failure I've had is when you feel rejected, and
because you care so much.
Yeah. So, yeah.
Okay. And then follow-up question would be, as a business owner, what has been the most rewarding part of all of this?
I would say, I think one thing I've really valued from being a business owner is like the flexibility that I've had with my kids. I know it's a lot of work. It is a lot of work, but I do think it's more flexible. And so I'm really thankful for that, the opportunity I've had to work from home, to be there during certain times with my kids. Has been really worth it to stay up until 3 or 4 or 5 a.m. to work and finish things, because I was able to take 2 hours off, in the afternoon. Nice. So, yeah. So that's what's been most rewarding.
That's great.
Yeah. Jocelyn, you mentioned you used to live in Southern California. Now you're in Fresno. How'd that happen? And tell us what you think about living here over Southern California.
Yeah, so we moved to Fresno. Now it's been 7 years. It'll be 7 years in September. And so I'm actually originally from Michigan. And so I was born and raised in Michigan, and I moved to Southern California for college. And it really, there's a lot of good things about Southern California, but it never felt like home to me. I'm more probably Midwestern and plain and basic. So I felt like, it doesn't quite feel like home. And what happened was that my sister and her family, they actually have 6 kids as well, and they moved to Fresno. Her husband's job transferred him here in 2015, and when I heard that, I spoke with my husband and I said, you know what, they're going to be in Fresno. That's like 4 hours away. So that's better than being, across the country. But I would love to be neighbors with them. If we have a chance, I'd love to live closer to them. Mm-hmm. So I started to look for Matthew a job here in Fresno. And he was like, hey, he's fine with it. If you want to find something and if it's the right thing, then I'll look at it. And so I did end up finding him a really good fit. Thank God. I know it was from the Lord because it was like a perfect fit for him. And so he ended up getting that job, and then we moved here. And we've been here for 7 years. By the way, my sister and her family moved after 1 year.
Oh,
no. So we lost them pretty much right away. But since we've been in Fresno, it's been just such a great place, especially for having a family. Mm-hmm. And we've made really good friends here, and just people I think sometimes people say, the people make the place. And I think that Fresno has such good quality, people with values who just care and are nice, and that's not everywhere. And so that's what's really been, made it a good experience.
Love it. You don't miss the traffic?
Oh, gosh. Yeah, we already talked about that. We already talked about that. There's so many good things about Fresno. Yeah. The traffic, no traffic being one of them.
For sure.
Yeah.
Well, we have thoroughly enjoyed having you here today. Thanks so much for coming and sharing your wealth of knowledge. If people want to reach you, how can they find you?
Oh, yeah. So you can reach me on my email address, which is researchwithjocelyn, JOCELYN, @gmail, or on my website, bloominsights.net.
Awesome. Thanks again, Jocelyn.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for spending time with us at Extremely Valid Points Podcast. To learn more about this episode, see our show notes at extremelyvalidpoints.com. Be sure and subscribe to our podcast on Apple, Spotify, or Google Podcasts, or wherever you like to listen. Follow us on Facebook, subscribe to us on YouTube and Instagram at EVP_podcast.
If you need help with your video for your business or nonprofit, connect with Dave at ellipsispro.co.
And if you need help with digital marketing, Nathan and Jenny can be found at worldlightmedia.com.
Or feel free to send us an email at questions@extremelyvalidpoints.com. Thanks again for joining us. See you next time.